Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Great to have you with us today. We're about a week and a half or so away from the general election. The leaders' debates are coming up in just a couple of days. And as we mentioned on a previous podcast, we're going to be doing something with the podcast during the English-speaking debate. We're going to tell you more about that a little bit later on in the podcast. Before we get into our main thrust here today, some housekeeping stuff on a couple of issues that we covered on previous podcasts. And by the way, I thank you for the feedback that we're getting on all the stuff that we're dropping on podcasts and your input, your ideas about what we should be doing. And certainly, as we've talked about right from the get-go here, your opportunity to weigh in on this, because I think it's so important in a democratic system to have feedback and to have dialogue back and forth about what's happening. It creates interest. Hopefully, it creates more interest as we go forward. And you can have a back and forth discussion about the good, the bad, and the ugly of some of the things that are going on. And a couple of points here that I wanted to give you kind of an update on. One was what we discussed in the last podcast, I believe it was, about Pierre Poilievre and his compliance agreement with they call some discrepancies. And this is a legal document that he signed with Elections Canada, and it had to do with Poliev back in the days when he was a government minister under the Harper government. And I talked about that, and of course, he's the only MP, I guess, that actually has something like this right now. It doesn't happen very often, but then, of course, most people play by the rules. And in one case, Poliev apparently didn't do that. I had a couple of people, actually, I think it was one comment in particular that a couple of other people jumped on and said, you're making a big deal about nothing. All he did was wear a conservative golf shirt to a couple of events. Yeah, he did, which, by the way, is bad form. I don't think it's illegal, but it was bad form. But it was referenced in the report from Elections Canada. But you're missing the point. He wore that conservative golf shirt to two events in Nova Scotia as the minister. But the problem is not that he wore the golf shirt. It's that he funded those events, the events themselves, the staffing for it, and the whole shebang with government money. And that's a no-no, especially during an election campaign. Yeah, you can get away with that, certainly, if there's no election going on and you're the minister or whatever, and you want to make a funding announcement. And of course, yeah, they make a big deal of it, and the balloons are out there and everything else. But during an election campaign, you're not supposed to use government money. And Poliev did, not once, but twice, in two separate events in Nova Scotia, which, by the way, essentially constitute, when you look at the cost of those things, it constitutes a donation to the Conservative Party by the government of Canada. And again, that's a no-no. And that's what Poliev was guilty of in those situations. And I know if you want to be dismissive of that, even his old boss, Stephen Harper, upon questioning in question period a couple of months after, admitted that, yeah, it was the wrong thing to do and should never have happened. Well, it did, and that's why the compliance agreement is that. It's got nothing to do with the golf shirt itself. It's a matter of using government money in the wrong way to try to find something for a political purpose. And I wanted to set the record straight on that. The other point is something we talked about earlier, and of course it has to do with some of the attacks and counterattacks that are going on. And Poliev and his team trying to make a big deal, of course, of Mark Carney and his work previously, of course, before he got into politics with Brookfield Asset Management and using tax shelters in a couple of different places. Not, by the way, just for his money. I mean, he was a manager of the accounts. So if you had invested in Brookfield, you may have taken advantage of that. Everything was above board and legal. But Poliev was trying to make a big deal about it, that Carney wasn't paying taxes and Canadians weren't paying taxes. We've looked into this with a number of different experts, economists and others, that said that a lot of what's going on here, what Poliev seems to be playing on, is the fact that most people don't understand how these things work or why they're in place. And as I mentioned in the previous podcast, the rules and parameters for using a tax shelter in situations like that were actually set up by the Harper government. With those governments of those other entities, the Cayman Islands and down in the Bahamas, because there's something that gets used on a pretty regular basis by an awful lot of people, not just the rich and healthy and the wealthy for that matter. But upon further investigation, multiple conservative MPs have personally invested in that company, in the Brookfield company. And of course, in the interest of full disclosure, we had to have that. Disclosure reports filed with the Office of the Conflict of Interest show that seven conservative MPs, including the deputy leader, Melissa Lantsman, and two former shadow cabinet ministers, have stock in investment with Brookfield Asset Management related to the company since 2024. Did they benefit from this? Are they hiding some of their money? Is Brookfield doing that? I don't know. But that's what these people do. So apparently it's okay for them to criticize Carney for managing this organization, which was his job at the time. But it's also okay for the conservatives themselves to benefit from something like this. So, like we mentioned yesterday, you can't suck and blow here. It's either good or it's bad. And if your guys are using it at the same time, then you're being a hypocrite, a very, very hypocritical stance to suggest that it's wrong for Carney to be involved, but it's okay for our members of our caucus to be involved. So that's that. Now, which I guess kind of dovetails to a certain extent what I want to get into today. And that's the other announcement that Poliev seems to be hanging his hat on these days, and it's the get tough on crime idea. Now, he's made a couple of speeches about this, and I mentioned this when he brought this up the first time. For me and for a lot of other journalists, this is deja vu all over again, because we went down this road when Stephen Harper was the prime minister some time ago. And he basically tried to do the same thing here. We're going to get tough on crime, mandatory sentences. You're convicted, you're a 3-time loser, they lock you up and throw away the key. And which sounds great and got great response from some of the partisan crowds at these rallies. And, for people that are concerned about law and order, which should be all of us, it resonates with an awful lot of them. To shoot holes in this thing is not to suggest that, we want to let criminals go free on the street. Not at all. As a matter of fact, the Paul Bernardos and the Clifford Olsons and the Robert Latimers, they're getting what they deserve and what they earn. Paul Bernardo, I know there are some hearings that come up every now and then with parole board situations, and people will say, oh, my God, he doesn't even deserve the chance. He's never going to get out of jail. We know that. But those are the laws, and that's the way things are going. The bottom line with Poliev's suggestions, and like I say, he was in government when Harper went through all this stuff, so I don't know if he wasn't paying attention or if he just didn't understand what was happening. But the bottom line with all these tough on crime things that he's proposing once again, which I think he really just dusted off the ones that Harper tried to use back in his day, they don't work. That's the reality here. They don't work. What the Harper government was doing, and what Poliev seems to be parroting here once again, was essentially what happened with a lot of southern states back in the 1990s. They were going to get tough on crime, and we've heard that rhetoric from American politicians for quite some time. And they went through with it in many different jurisdictions and many down the states, 3-strike laws, mandatory sentencing, and things of this nature. And what they found was, first of all, it's one size fits all, and you can't do that with legal issues. Somebody who steals a jacket or even a pizza slice gets treated the same way as somebody who commits a grievous crime, a major offense, because it's the 3 strikes and you're out thing. That just doesn't seem to make any sense. But here's what happened as a result of this. Yeah, okay, you're convicted, 3-time loser, bang, go away, lock them up. You hear that phrase all the time. What it really resulted in was court systems were backlogged, prison populations ballooned, and even more importantly for you people, that all of us who are concerned about crime and about law and order, there was no perceptible change in crime rates. I know, one of the arguments, well, at least that person will be locked up. Somebody else is going to take their place. And as I talked about a number of times with Crown prosecutors and defense attorneys, as we had this debate back in the Harper era days of their idea about crime and punishment, anybody who commits a crime doesn't think they're going to get caught. All right. So, to say, is it going to be a deterrent? No, if you want to rob a bank or you want to do something else, you're not going to say, well, I'll do this and then I'll get caught and I'll do my time. You don't think you're going to get caught. So the idea that this is actually deterrent is really rather frivolous argument. And as the death penalty was back in the day, too. Some people actually wanted to bring that stuff back, too. But he's really dredging something up here that was shot down by the Supreme Court of Canada. There's a process in place. And, if they didn't like the decision, they can appeal, which is what happened, of course, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was ruled to be against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And for whatever reason, if you want to look at this from an ethical standpoint, from a human rights standpoint, that's fine. But the bottom line, as we talked about before, even if you're dismissive of those arguments, this whole idea doesn't make our streets safer. All it does is clog the courts up. We're outraged now when we hear of a story of somebody who's been charged with some grievous offenses. And at some point, some judge has to look at this and say, I got a case dismissed. It's taking way too long to get here. Justice delayed is justice denied, right? And this happened all too often because it's just clogging up the systems. Are we going to pay more money now to build more prisons to house these people if this was going to happen? That's going to cost a ton of money. What's it cost? Something like $115,000 to $120,000 a year to keep somebody in prison. times how many people are we going to throw away at the key and just leave them there? That's going to cost. It's going to cost more for prisons. Is that really how you think you're going to lower the crime rate, by building more prisons and putting people away? It doesn't work. It costs taxpayers money, to the point where now history says that most of those states that tried this back in the 90s have abandoned it because it was a stupid idea. It didn't work. And just as we're hearing story after story from those jurisdictions that, hey, yeah, it was a dumb idea, the Harper government decided, yeah, but we're going to do it here. No surprise that the Supreme Court ruled in the manner that they did. But now Poliev is threatening, and that's maybe the right word here, to invoke the notwithstanding clause and simply say, yeah, I know the courts think it's illegal. It's against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but we're going to do it anyway. And he made some flimsy excuse that, well, people have the right to be free and not have to worry about crime. Well, sorry, Pierre, but this has been something that has been tried and tried and tried, and it doesn't increase people's freedom. It does not increase public safety. It costs the taxpayers a ton of money, but with no results. I know I wanted to get into the logistics of the notwithstanding clause anyway, which I think is a dumb idea. It's been in place, and I think, again, premiers and others have tried to use and suggest maybe even abuse the notwithstanding clause over the last number of years. Basically, if the courts or somebody else shoots down their idea, they simply say, well, this is my get out of jail free card. I'm going to do this anyway, even though it might be illegal, even though it might be unethical, even though it might trample on somebody's rights and freedoms. I'm going to do it anyway. And it was really a throw-in. We could spend hours talking about the reasons why and the debate that led up to this, but it was really the debate that was going on between the premiers and the federal government to go through with the Charter of Rights and to develop this made in Canada solution to this. And as you might expect, when there was a debate going on between premiers and the federal government, there was not a lot of consensus. And basically, this was a bone that they threw onto the table at the last minute to say, okay, here's your card. Here's a wild card that you guys can use. If you don't like what we're doing, if you think that the federal government's got too much power, you can invoke the notwithstanding clause. Are you guys okay with that? Yeah, okay, sure. And they all signed on. I guess under the premise that, okay, now we can all live happily ever after. Well, we're not living happily ever after. And if this were to go through, and I understand that's a lot of ifs, if Poliev were to win the election, if he decides to move through with this and try to invoke this, it would be the first time a federal government has ever used the notwithstanding clause in a situation like that. I don't know that it's going to happen. The polls these days, thankfully, are suggesting that may not happen simply because Poliev's not going to be the guy that's going to make those decisions. But we don't know that. As we said, that's what elections are for. But this is not a smart idea. It's one of these things that's based on emotion, but it's not based on common sense, and it's not based on reality. And you're not talking in the hypothetical here, because this is something that has been tried and proven to be a failure in the past. What's the idea? What's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Time and time again, we've tried this idea about getting tough on crime by throwing away the key and simply say we're going to make this even more punitive. It doesn't make us safer. So why is Poliev doing this right now? Well, the old grasping at straws thing, I guess, when you're behind in the polls, may come to mind as part of the result of what's been going on here in the last couple of weeks. But please, let's keep this in mind. And let's talk about, I understand emotion runs high during elections, but we also have to have some people that are going to be sensible about this, not just with economic issues, but when it comes to everyday and quality of life issues as well. Which leads me back as we finish off here. In just a couple of days, we're going to be having the leaders debate. Well, the French debate, of course, and then the following night is the English language debate. And on Thursday, the 17th, we are going to be going live for the first time ever on the Bill Kelly podcast. You can join us at 6:30 for kind of a pregame show. Members portal on our YouTube channel right now for a pre-debate. You can have a live stream Q&A. And we've already had a number of people that have submitted questions and expressed interest in this. And I'm looking forward to doing this. Kind of takes me back to the radio days for years and years when we used to do these sorts of things. And it's going to be interesting to get your feedback on this and your chance to kind of dive into some of the key issues shaping this election and give you some insights into this. Now, you can catch the live stream on our YouTube channel and support the show by becoming a member. And all the details about this, of course, are there. Just a couple of bucks a month, and you'll have access to regular Q&As, early access to content, lots of personal lectures, too. And, of course, your support on the webpage helps keep the conversation going and ensures that we can continue bringing this informed commentary. It's been a great ride, and we're going to continue this ride, not just now up to the election, but after the election too, because we got people engaged. That's one of the main drives and one of the main ambitions of this podcast is to get people engaged, to get them talking, and to see different points of view. We used to do that all the time. We used to celebrate diversity. We used to celebrate intelligence. We don't do that anymore. It's just that this is the way I think, and anybody who doesn't agree with me is an idiot. Well, that's not the way you govern, and it's certainly not the way that we should coexist with others in this society of ours. So let's keep the dialogue going. Join us if you can. Look forward to your participation in that on Thursday and in future podcasts as well. That's it for this edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast. Of course, you can catch us on Substack and Spotify and Apple and on YouTube, on Blue Sky, and so many other different platforms over the next little while. It's important that we keep talking about this, and we're going to do this on the podcast, and we look forward to your participation. Join us on English Language Debate Night on Thursday, and we'll get into the down and dirty of some of the politics that are going on. In the meantime, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.